I want to welcome you all to today's panel discussion, which is on designing an inclusive digital world. This is an event put on by the Center for Information Technology and Policy here at Princeton, and we have assembled what I think is a stellar panel for you to dig into these issues today. In particular, I think the motivation for the panel today is the idea that digital technology in particular presents, or I would rather say, opens up new opportunities for people with disabilities, while at the same time possibly introducing new obstacles or keeping them from enjoying similar opportunities as others. There are a number of fronts to discuss here. One could be a focus on how new technologies can empower people with disabilities, and that work tends to focus on issues around assistive technologies, and we'll hear about that today. Another front is around accessibility. So in a way, what we're witnessing is that there's a kind of reproduction of the kind of material conditions that have kept people with disabilities from enjoying certain kinds of opportunities in the built environment. The kind of canonical example here is stairs, keeping people in wheelchairs from being able to access certain buildings. And that similar things are now happening in the digital and virtual environments as well. That these are not just things that are true in the physical environment. And so how do we address those issues? And finally, I think there's also this other front to explore, which is the way in which digital technology offers new affordances that in a way perhaps destabilize some of the strict distinctions that we have between people with disabilities and the non-disabled. And that there's an opportunity here to see in the kind of new and unexpected affordances of digital technologies a way of moving past some of these binaries and thinking more creatively and broadly about these topics. So in general, today's panel discussion will focus on the role of design in building an inclusive digital world, on the kind of engineering issues that we can address here. And we'll hear about a number of different kinds of issues, or from a number of different perspectives, I should say. So in particular, we'll hear comments on corporate decision-making by tech companies, about human-computer interaction, about theories of design, and about the role of law and policy in promoting and enforcing certain design choices. So what I'll do very quickly, well maybe not so quickly because it's such an amazing group of people, but I'll introduce you to the panel and I'll give you a brief rundown of their research and background. So I'll try to do this in order. Okay, so to my left is Keith Hiatt. Keith is a doctoral candidate in jurisprudence and social policy at UC Berkeley. He has also received his JD from Berkeley, and generally he studies law, technology, and rights. His dissertation is very topical. It examines how web and mobile developers make decisions about accessibility for people with disabilities when designing products and services. Keith also has spent a number of years working as a pro bono attorney, focusing in particular on housing advocacy, and has brought a large number of cases in the East Palo Alto area, and has been recognized with awards for this service. And prior to law school, Keith also worked for a number of years at Microsoft doing software development, engineering, and test. Then to Keith's left is Mara Mills, who is an assistant professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University, which actually is where I received my doctorate. She works at the intersection of disability studies and media studies and works primarily from a historical perspective. She is currently completing a book titled On the Phone, Deafness and Communication Engineering. Articles from this project have appeared in a number of leading journals, and she's already at work at her second book, which is on print disability and new reading formats, which examines the reformatting of print over the course of the past century by blind and other print disabled readers, and with a focus on talking books and electronic reading machines. Mara has degrees in biology and literature from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and completed her doctoral work in the History of Science department at Harvard. And her research has been supported by a number of premier funders. To her left is Clayton Lewis. Clayton is a professor of computer science and a fellow of the Institute of Cognitive Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's also an alumnus of Princeton, class of 1966. He received his AB in mathematics here. Clayton is well known for his research on evaluation methods and user interface design, the thinking aloud method and cognitive walkthrough methods are in regular use in software development organizations around the world. Clayton's work in human-computer interaction on cognitive disabilities is equally influential, and he has done very important work on cognitive assistant technology and more recent work on the future of inclusive design online. Clayton has served in a number of leadership capacities in professional societies, including the ACM's Computer-Human Interaction Special Interest Group, and has led a number of these annual conferences. He's received a number of awards for his contributions to the field by the ACM, and is also recently named the University of Colorado President's Teaching Scholar, which signifies the university's highest award for teaching. Finally, to close out the panel, we have Michael Ashley Stein, who is a professor of law at the College of William and Mary School of Law, and co-founder and executive director of the Project on Disability and visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School. Michael is an internationally renowned expert on disability rights. He has participated in the drafting of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and he works with disabled persons organizations around the world, actively consults with international governments on their disability laws and policies, and advises a number of United Nations bodies. He's also most recently the author of a paper on integrating the internet, which is forthcoming in the George Washington Law Review. Michael holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a PhD from Cambridge University. He is taught at Harvard, NYU, Stanford, and he's clerked for the now Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, and practiced law for a number of years at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York. He is also, like the rest of the panel, the recipient of numerous awards, his in particular from global disability rights organizations, and his research has also been funded by an equally large number of organizations. So, an extremely impressive group for you here with lots of interesting experience, and I think what I'll do is just kind of launch into things by inviting each person to kind of start us off with a 10-minute introduction covering some of their work. I'll then try to touch on some common themes, pull out some common themes, and we'll have a discussion. I'll also invite the panelists to pose questions to each other, and then we'll set aside a big chunk of time at the end to have an open-ended conversation among the group here. So I think if there is any order here, I suppose it would be Keith. So Keith, if you wouldn't mind starting us off. Thanks.
Thank you.
And you should feel free to sit, or if you would like to use the recording.
Can everyone hear me okay if I speak while seated here? Okay, great. Thank you. So my name is Keith Hiatt. I'm a law and society scholar, or an aspiring law and society scholar. I came to the topic of disability rights and technology in sort of a roundabout way, I think. But my first experience with disability rights, thinking about disability rights, came when I was working at Microsoft, but was called to serve as a juror in a disability discrimination case against Boeing, which actually was my former employer. But it was in Seattle, so everybody had some sort of relationship to Boeing, and so it didn't strike me from the jury. Everyone always asks me about that. I don't think I was biased. Maybe. But it was a fascinating case. It went on for 3 weeks, and introduced me to a lot of issues I didn't know anything about, and was fascinated by. And I felt like at the end of that experience, I wanted to be a professional juror. It paid $10 a day, and was hard to. It's a very selective job. It's hard to get more than once a year. So I had to do something else. So I thought maybe it was time to go to law school and find a way to do something close to that. But I framed my juror certificate, and it is my highest legal credential. I always reminded my judge when I clerked for the Ninth Circuit, I always reminded him that I had actually decided a case, decided facts in a case. So I always had that over. I'll keep this brief because I want to hear from the rest of the panel, and I want to leave a lot of time for a discussion. But I thought I'd say a couple of things so you know my orientation and what I'm working on. When I was at Microsoft, we were designing websites. It was still in the early days of the web in a lot of respects. It didn't seem like it then, but it seems like it now. And one of the things that I came across was in the software design process, there's what we call a spec, or product specification, where you outline exactly all the features that your software product or your website should have. You enumerate them, you list them, and you explain how they're supposed to work. And the spec is like it's like the law for your product. If a feature is laid out and designed in the spec, and then you build the product and it doesn't work the way it was explained in the spec, then you have a bug. So you don't know what your bugs are unless you look at the spec. If your product or your software isn't working right, or working, it seems like something's broken, you have to go back and compare it to the spec. That's where the software nerd joke comes up that, oh, that's not a bug, that's a feature. Well, what they mean is that's in the spec. If it's in the spec, it's a feature. If it's not in the spec, it's a bug. So when you're designing a spec, you have to think about your use cases. So you think about who are the users of this product and what are they going to use it for. And it's an interesting process, one that interested me even at the time, because our designers would interface with what they called usability experts, people who were social scientists often, who were studying who our users were and how they worked and how they used our products. And they would give these users names. So they would come up with stereotypical names for stereotypical users, like Fran might be a woman in her 40s who has 3 children and coaches soccer and has an income between $75,000 and $100,000 a year. And Charlie might be a teenager who's really into video games. And Malcolm might be a professor who uses the internet mostly for reading articles. So they would have these names, and then you would walk through use cases. Those became really relevant when we would do testing. We would do testing to walk through our software, our website, and figure out whether our software would meet the needs of these users. So that was interesting to me at the time because that was my job. I had to pay attention to the users and how to make them happy. One of the things that I thought was interesting was how we made decisions about who our users were and what they were using the internet for. So often when we came across problems, like it's been a long time now, so this is old news, but when we came across problems like, hey, this website that we just built works great with Internet Explorer, but it doesn't work with Firefox, or it doesn't work with Netscape, which is a big deal at the time. We could say things like, well, who cares? We don't want them as users anyway. Or maybe we need to make it work for Safari. There's a lot of Mac users out there. There are becoming more Mac users out there. Maybe we need to make this thing work for Opera, which was a browser back then, or Safari. But maybe we don't really care about Netscape anymore. Maybe we can just drop that and say it's unsupported. But there was a conscious deliberation about, do we have enough users for this to be a justified use of our time? Trying to make our website accessible to Netscape, testing it to make sure it works with Netscape. So this is sort of a long-winded introduction to how I came to thinking about accessibility when I got to law school and started thinking about my interests, and when I started my PhD, seeing how they sort of converged. I'd been involved at that point in disability rights advocacy for a while. And I saw technology as this area of promise, hope, but also pessimism, skepticism, because you could start to see that there's nothing about the digital world or cyberspace that immunizes us from the same sorts of biases and old hatreds and jealousies and social injustices that occur in physical space. We just sort of port them with us when we go to cyberspace. So, but cyberspace is different in other ways. Websites are different in other ways. They're not, for example, as Lawrence Lessig observed, cyberspace has no essential nature. There's nothing about cyberspace that has to be one way, that can't be changed. As he says, there's nothing about cyberspace that they couldn't be otherwise. They couldn't be different. Because everything we build there is a design choice. So cyberspace, in my view and in my way of thinking, is always constructed, designed, maybe not deliberated, but could have been deliberated space. It's something you could have thought about. So I'm interested in sort of the gaps in the design process. What are the users we're not thinking about? Why aren't we thinking about them? And when we do think about them, how does that happen? How does that play out? So in my research, I'm studying how technology companies, internet and mobile device companies, make decisions about providing accessible products and services for people with disabilities. I'm doing through using a variety of qualitative methods. I'm interviewing, doing field observations, and reading documents, watching videos, but trying to get into the thought process of how software design engineers, device designers, product managers, how they think of and how they frame and construct disability and accessibility when making design choices. So I might talk about that in the course of the panel, about some of the things I'm finding. One of the things I want to understand is, I'm going to open my laptop. I'm not going to show you anything. I just wanted to read a quote, because I know there's nothing more exciting in a presentation than hearing someone read quotes. But this one I thought was worth sharing. It happened earlier this year. It's topical, and when it happened, it was a sort of a big deal for me because it was right in line with what I'm studying. But at Apple's shareholder meeting back in February, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, was getting pressed by a conservative activist shareholder who had proposed that Apple's board of directors adopt a resolution binding it to only take measures that have a return on investment, an ROI, that they can prove, that they can demonstrate. We're going to make money on this. That investor was mostly concerned about Apple's investments in green technology, in going green. This investor thinks that's a bunch of hogwash and a big waste of money, and you should only do it if there's a demonstrable return on investment. And Tim Cook by all accounts, got agitated, got a little upset, and said he had no intention of adopting that policy. And then he gave this example that I thought was super interesting, because he gave it as the no-brainer example. He said, when we work to make our devices accessible to the blind, I don't consider the bloody ROI. And then later, if you want me to do things only for ROI reasons, you should get out of this stock. Like, for Tim Cook, that's a pretty firm tell-off to somebody. But it was interesting to me that he used making accessible technology as sort of the no-brainer, like as the one that no one would argue with. We're going to do it because I don't care about ROI. Well, that's interesting to me for many reasons. One, because I don't know exactly the moment it happened that became the no-brainer example. There are lots of companies that don't work to make their products accessible for the blind or for other people with disabilities. So I'm not sure how that happened, but something shifted. I compared that quote to a statement from the director of accessibility policy at Microsoft, not in response to Tim Cook, just a statement on accessibility, where he said, we see people with disabilities as a market. That's really common. Often you'll hear designers or software companies talk about people with disabilities in terms of raw numbers. There are X million number of users in the world who can't see. They'll say there are more blind people than there are Germans, and we wouldn't ignore Germany. So there's definitely this frame where people with disabilities are seen as a market that's underserved. I see that a lot in, there's one other quote I wanted to share with you from a software designer at Google. He was speaking at Google I/O a couple of years ago, and he said, building a business case is important. This was at Google I/O, one of their big developer conferences. If you want to integrate accessibility within your company, I'm a businessman. I'm in business to make money, and I'm in business for applications to be accessible, usable, and useful by as many people around the world as possible. So for right now, let's not think about people with disabilities, of which there are 826 million worldwide. Let's just concentrate on people like myself, 65 years of age and older. There's 519 million, and 1.2 billion people who never learned to read. How are they going to access your apps and go shopping and spend their money? That's where accessibility is powerful. That's interesting to me because it demonstrates something at work in accessibility that I'm still trying to get my finger on. And it's this shift from thinking about access. So you'll see it this talked about many different ways within the developer community. But some folks will talk about accessibility as being about doing the right thing. Some will talk about it as a matter of legal compliance. Some will talk about it as an opportunity, a big market opportunity. And often they'll talk about it the same way, within the same talk, sometimes even within the same paragraph. I'm trying to figure out how those different frameworks play out in real life. How do they play out in design decisions? And also I'm curious and sort of cautious about the way that people with disabilities as a market has the potential, I think, to dominate the entire conversation, which maybe is great. In some ways it's empowering, but in other ways, I think you get some drift. It reminds me in a way of a focus on when businesses sort of embrace the idea of green energy, or when businesses sort of embrace, in the corporate world, embrace the idea of diversity. And it ended up meaning something very different than what it meant in the beginning. It ended up being a message about, hey, diversity is great for business, so we need to make sure that we have people from all races and backgrounds in our company so that we can sell more products and make more money, which is sometimes an empowering message, but not the only reason to do something, and maybe has limitations. Maybe you run into some problems. If, for example, you think that the way to make the web accessible is, as this designer said, take me, for example, a 65-year-old man, let's design it for me. Then you end up with some problems, I think, that maybe some gaps. So that's what I'm studying, that's what I'm investigating, and hope to have some answers in the next year or so. Right now I have a lot of questions, so I think I'll leave it right there.
I'm a historian with a sprained ankle, so I'm going to limp up to the podium and give a history-style talk with not a PowerPoint, but with some images that I'll describe as I go through. So specifically, I'm a historian of electronics and so-called assistive technology. Assistive technology is a phrase that has been critiqued by many historians and many scholars in disability studies for its redundancy and for its seeming patronizing tone. I work on things like the history of the integrated circuit as told through the hearing aid, or the history of OCR as told through 20th century text-to-speech reading machines. As Solon mentioned, my current project is titled Print, Disability, and New Reading Formats, and it's a history of 20th century electronic tools for print access, including both talking books and scanner-based reading machines. I wrote an article for the journal Flow, which is an online journal. I have an image of the front page of this article here. A couple of years ago that gives a short overview of this research if you're interested. The GIF, this is the first article I've ever written with a GIF. I was very proud of myself, although I didn't make it, is of the Opticon in use by Candy Linville, who is the daughter of the Opticon inventor. And this is a text-to-tactile scanner and converter. So thanks to an NSF grant, this year I'm digitizing hundreds of historical recordings from non-copyrighted talking books to optophone or musical print sounds to early synthetic speech, like text-to-speech from the early Kurzweil readers. And for me, this is an attempt to build an archive of these oral reading formats, most of which aren't collected anywhere else. There's some at places like the AFB and NFB, and I'm digitizing those collections for those agencies, but many of them are in people's homes. There isn't, except for the Library of Congress Talking Book Collection, there isn't an obvious repository for this whole history of these oral reading formats. So to give you a sense of what I mean, I'm going to start by playing a couple of sounds from my own work, and then I'm going to give you some examples as a media studies professor, not as a historian of present-day access technologies. So let me play this example for you of what inclusion sounded like in an earlier technological era. This is the first of two files, and this one is an amateur recording. After World War II, with the founding of Recording for the Blind in an attic of the New York Public Library, now headquartered here in Princeton and called Learning Ally, a national volunteer network was established to narrate textbooks and pamphlets, really anything, any material on demand for blind students and later for blind people in the workforce. Separately, the Library of Congress sponsored and had been sponsoring for 20 years a talking book program using professional readers, but their catalog was mostly literature. It was entertainment reading. With apologies to at least one literature professor in the room who I know won't like me saying that, but it wasn't until the SoundScriber and tape technology and this volunteer network became available that people in schools and in the workplace could read almost anything on demand. And indeed, at that point, blind people began to do most of their talking book reading with amateur narrators, not with the highly polished, highly dramatic talking books that some of us are familiar with, or that are reminiscent of the, or not reminiscent, but prefatory to the audiobook industry today. So let me play about a 1.5 minute clip. This is my longest clip of one of these amateur readers from Recording for the Blind, reading a 1980 article written by vision scientist Paul Bacchi-Rita. He's probably most famous for inventing the tongue display unit, and it was produced for Harvey Lauer, a man I've been doing an oral history with. He's blind, and he was the technology transfer specialist for over 30 years for the VA.
Number one, the application of technology to the problems of the visually handicapped. The visually handicapped have benefited from technology for centuries. Our eyeglasses are so common that it is easy to forget that the introduction of lenses into daily life of persons with visual disabilities as a major step in rehabilitation medicine. I will not attempt to review the fascinating history of the applications of technology to visual problems which have attracted some of the most brilliant minds in recorded history, including Franklin and Helmholtz. Instead, I wish to discuss two types of technology transfer. The first of these is the development of high technology devices such as the factile vision substitution system and the implanted visual prosthesis that offered the possibility of eventually becoming sufficiently developed and practical aids to improve the quality.
Harvey is a pack rat. He's a historian's dream, and I've visited him in his house in Aurora, Illinois many times, and he has a garage filled with what I think are about 200 boxes just of tapes, and I've been going through those with him, and I'm digitizing as many as I can. Many of them are to me very rare text-to-tone and early text-to-speech tapes, and a lot of them are these talking books, which at first I completely ignored. And the first 2 trips I went to visit him, I didn't even bother taking any of them or listening to them, and then he said to me, this is what I was listening to at work, this is how I read, this is what electronic access sounded like at that time. This is the 80s. I'm not just interested in the format per se, the books per se, but in how the act of reading took place. So for the purposes of school and work, people often needed to speed read. Obviously, Harvey didn't usually read this at this speed. Records and later tapes were played on high speed. Beginning in the 1930s, I found letters by blind people using phonograph players and playing them, ramping up the speed, even before variable speed was an option, beginning in the 30s. And readers basically just adjusted to the distorted sound, the Donald Duck speech or chipmunk speech that came out before at the other end. In the 1970s, technologies such as the Vocom-1 allowed taped speech to be compressed in time without the pitch being shifted. So the act of reading could take place something like this.
The excerpt is from the book Listening and Speaking by Ralph Nichols and Thomas Lewis. It requires close listening and concentration. Ready? Here we go. This speech is compressed to 40% the original time using Solon 1. Today, there is a real awakening in education to the importance of listening. That is, to the importance of learning through listening. In every state of the union, people in business or education are recognizing the real function of listening is to learn, but the all-important central contribution to make to the individual growth and development is that of making learning easier, more pleasant, and more economical. The origin of much of our current interest is very simple.
So Harvey would attach a Vocom-1 to his tape player and speed up the tape speech. This is a grandparent technology to auto-tune, a pitch shifter, which some of you are probably familiar with if you listen to pop music at all, and also to speed listening with screen reader technology, which many blind people do today. As a historian of technologies, this set of technologies is a huge interest to me. But as a professor of media studies, I have to say that almost none of my students are historians, and also almost none of them are computer programmers. I regularly teach an undergraduate class titled Disability, Technology, and Media. What do I teach to my students in this class? Since they're not doing programming, they're not historians. I'll give you a couple of examples. I ask them to make a contribution to online accessibility by working with programs that crowdsource things like captioning and audio description. I also introduce them to the design theories that currently motivate a lot of work in disability studies, work done by designers and by critics alike. I've learned almost everything I know about design from my friend and colleague Sarah Hendren, a professor at Solon College of Engineering who runs the website Abler. I'm showing a recent page from Abler here with a picture of a sort of stiff cardboard portable podium. Sarah comments in this blog or in this website on art and adaptive technology, applying design theory to her own projects and to those of others. So for instance, she recently posted this image and description of it, what she calls an alternative podium that she created for curator Amanda Caccia, who's 4'3". Sarah explains that this kind of design is designed for, one, radically tailored to the wishes and self-defined needs of design partners with atypical bodies or neurocognitive conditions. From another page of her blog, she also describes interrogative design, critical design, or resonant design. This page is just text. I'll just read how she defines these design concepts, since design is one of our themes today. She says that these are design strategies for problem finding as well as problem solving, suspending questions by pressing together in one artifact or set of artifacts seemingly disparate or opposing ideas, thinking about what Anthony Dunn, who coined the phrase critical design, calls parafunctionality, design that lives among recognizable realms of utility, but expands, as he says, beyond conventional definitions of functionalism to include the poetic. Resonant design, which she doesn't say much more about, is a phrase coined by Graham Pullen in his book Design Meets Disability, out a few years ago from MIT Press, really field-breaking book. Resonant design specifically attempts to create unexpected resonances between different groups. It amplifies needs, desires, or actions that are shared between disabled and non-disabled individuals. Audiobooks, talking books clearly fall into this category. And you could go through Abler and on as different. If you're interested in design theory and how it's being applied both to digital and non-digital and mixed artifacts, just go through Abler. This is a picture of something that she calls design fiction or speculative design, done by the Design Culture Lab at Victoria University of Wellington. It's a cast that's made of textiles, but you also get the data history of the sheep from which the merino wool came, she explains what design fiction is. It's something slightly different than resonant design. You might not even create a product that ever sees the light of day. It's supposed to be a type of fiction writing almost in the objects. Okay, so I go through these sort of design ideas with my students, and then I ask them in several assignments to work with already produced software that crowdsources accessibility. And I think most of this software we think of as examples of inclusive designs, maybe even universal design, but as I just walk through a few of them in 5 minutes, I hope I can make the argument that electronic accessibility can be at once functional and also critical. So this is a page, the front page of Amara, which is a good example, I think, of resonant design. Amara was co-founded by Dean Jansen, who's currently a Data and Society Fellow. The mission of the company, as stated on this front page, is to make video more globally accessible through subtitling in multiple languages and also captioning for deaf viewers. There's a page where deaf and hard of hearing users can request specific videos or video clips to be captioned, and I asked my students to caption these. And I'll play you an example of what one of my students came up with. I won't play the whole thing, just like 10 seconds of it.
Stupid and dangerous activities. Do not attempt to reenact, recreate, or reincarnate any of the following stunts, dares, and pretty much anything that's performed in this video. Your discretion is advised. On today's episode of Sean's Room,
So, what are we doing today, Sean? Tell them. We are going. You get it? PewDiePie's house? Yeah. We are going. Where are we? We're going to like the middle of the desert. I'm still sick. We're gonna go shoot birds. We never did that. Have you done that? Shot a shotgun before? You myself. Well.
So the part of the video clip I just showed was two young men in their house talking to the camera about a trip to go shooting in the desert that they're about to take. And you know, asking my students to caption videos online, of course it taught them something about captioning, but it also got them to think critically about the semiotics of sound, which as a media studies professor was an added benefit of the assignment, and part of what I think is the critical design of how the way accessibility teaches us something about media. When is a pause important enough to register in text with an ellipsis? When is a pause meaningful? What about non-speech sounds or noise? Do we only caption speech? When is this non-speech sound meaningful? How should music be described? When should the speakers be named? And on and on. We had great discussions about this in the class. I had one of my students in the class is deaf. How would is there a presumed user in accessibility technologies that is non-disabled? This was another topic that came up over and over again. I also asked my students to use to do audio description using a platform called YouDescribe, which was produced by Josh Mealy, who's a blind engineer at Smith Kettlewell, working with the team there. There used to be several programs for audio description by volunteers: CapScribe, Magpie, LiveDescribe. Some of you may be familiar with these. They're all either no longer available or they have failed to be updated, so it was like very essential that Smith Kettlewell put this together. It's still in beta, but it was extremely easy for my class and for myself to use. So YouDescribe has a video tutorial with rules for describing videos for blind users, mainly be concise and objective, not that different than the rules that the ACB and other groups have put out. But the wild variety of material found on YouTube often confounds those rules and also often confounds verbal description. So I'll just play a few seconds of this video that one of my students described. It's a beatboxing piece by an artist named Tom Thumb.
Tom Thumb sits by his turntable and starts a click track in full 4x signature. He holds a microphone with his right hand and starts beatboxing into it. Using his voice, he then adds a bass line into the track. He starts gently humming a melody line into the track.
Again, there's professional describers out there, but there's too much media for them to handle. So similar to the talking book, this history of talking books requiring a volunteer network, this is what's happening in the digital world with these crowdsourcing kinds of applications. This is an interesting one to me because the scene doesn't change. And in fact, my student opted not to describe Tom Thumb himself or the room he's sitting in. It's a young man just sitting in a room doing things with an otherwise black boxed set of electronic equipment. So what my student did was describe the man's micro gestures, his engagement with the electronic equipment, which is otherwise, I think, opaque to most listeners and viewers. And I think we can think of this as an example of resonant design too, since it almost functions as an instructional video about beatboxing. When I first listened to this sort of distractedly, I thought I didn't realize it was I thought it was just a song with instruments that he was playing. I didn't realize that I didn't read the subtitle and realize it was beatboxing, that everything was coming out of his mouth. Okay, so the final one I want to show you is called AxisMap. It was made by Jason De Silva, an award-winning filmmaker who has multiple sclerosis. This website and the app that goes with it is an example of a digital tool for finding and reviewing accessible public spaces. So not a digital tool for making digital inclusion, but a digital tool for making inclusion in public space. It's very simple to use. A reviewer rates a public space based on the wheelchair accessibility of its entryway and its bathroom. I'm showing the interface on the screen here. You see a map, you see entryway, entry steps, bathroom with a certain number of stars that you can give it. In the case of steps, how many steps are there? It's also rated on spaciousness and loudness. Now, the student of mine who completed this review is blind and uses screen reading software. And she wrote the following note to me, which I then forwarded to Jason about the interface after completing the assignment. She said, the website headlines with the phrase, accessibility starts here. Unfortunately, accessibility soon ended for me when trying to accomplish the assignment. While the search functions were very accessible, the rating area was not. Rather than having graphic buttons to click on to rate, it could just appear as a radio button. This would then have been accessible to a screen reader. So she could read, but not interact. She couldn't take action on the screen. Aside from my personal inaccessibility qualms, the assignment made me think about accommodation in inaccessible locations. I had never thought to ask a restaurant if they owned a ramp, or thought about the bathroom in a location in regards to the height of the sink or paper towel dispenser. I rated a bar that I love, but only now it hit me how much the one step up is a barrier to accessibility. So although the radio button problem could easily be solved, even digital accessibility tools reveal the difficulties of truly universal design, and the difficulties in inclusion. So that's sort of my survey of the history of inclusion and a few tools for those of you in the room who aren't programmers and again, who aren't historians, that anyone can just use. They're very easy to use, unless you're using a screen reader, but in the case of the last one. If you want more if you're a humanist in particular and you want more information about more resources like these, I'll just end by recommending this program that the NEH is funding. It's a series of 2-day workshops. There's one left. They don't build on each other, so you can enter at any point. You can jump into this one, called Building an Accessible Future for the Humanities. And these involve training sessions on things like evaluating web accessibility, again, not as a programmer, but as a humanist using a certain website or assigning one, writing an accessibility statement, and becoming familiar with accessible hardware. The last workshop will be held in Emory next spring. Applications are due in February. And I'll leave this page up, which just has the agenda for the workshop.
Okay, well, thanks to the organizers for letting me participate and hear these really interesting presentations. So I want to put out an agenda for the group of challenges and opportunities in inclusion online. So first, some status. We're making some progress in making text accessible. I'll come back to that in a minute. We are making some progress there, but not in addressing the challenges of, quote, new, unquote, media, games, interactive simulations, maps, information visualizations, that sort of thing. The scare quotes around new are there because there's nothing new about maps. It's just that really, beyond learning how to tag text for screen readers, we're not really moving adequately on any of these other areas. I learned just today, actually, visiting with Mark Hakkinen and Jason White of ETS, who were here, that they've got some really exciting work going on, which is really encouraging. But apart from an island of work here and there, we're not doing nearly enough in these, again, I'll use the term new media. We shouldn't pat ourselves too strongly on the back, even in the case of text, I would argue, because best practices are sort of asymptotically converging to a state that none of us should be satisfied with, namely methods that are expensive and imperfect. They're never going to lead to a very general state of accessibility because these methods rely on training. So probably everybody in this room knows, but maybe not everybody in this room knows, that if you produce a document that has something that looks like a heading in it, like big font and bold, it won't look like a heading to a screen reader unless it's tagged properly, and that won't happen unless the person who creates the document is trained to produce it in the right way. We surely can do better than that. In an era in which a $100 camera can identify all the faces in the photograph, it shouldn't be beyond our technical capabilities to develop the ability to extract the structure from documents without requiring special tagging. Another area in which we need to do more work is addressing people whose needs are in the area of cognitive limitations or learning and language difficulties. There's a certain amount we know how to do there, but there's a lot more we need to be looking at. Advances in natural language processing can be harnessed in this area. We need to do that. Something that doesn't require new technology but requires more resolution is taking more advantage of content personalization. If you consider somebody interacting with the Social Security site, for example, looking to see if they're eligible for particular programs, today, typically, a person has to look through a huge number of programs which are simply not relevant to their circumstances, and it's up to them as the user to make those decisions that these things are relevant and other things aren't. If instead the site allows a user to authenticate, that then means that only those options which are relevant given what the system already knows about that person are actually going to be presented, which can be an enormous reduction in the amount of information that somebody has to wade through. That's just one example. So that's personalization of content. Personalization of presentation is becoming a reality. So I hope that many people know about the Global Public Inclusive Infrastructure Initiative. If you don't know about it, you can read about it at gpii.net. The core of this is technology that will allow anybody, person with a disability included, allow anybody to create a specification of how they want information to be presented to them and how they want to interact with it. That specification having been created can be automatically accessed by really any compliant technology, and that preference specification would then automatically be applied, whatever its content might be. So to take a simple example to illustrate this, today if I'm deaf, I'm going to want captions if captions are available when I view video. Today I've got to fiddle around over and over and over again to tell different video players that that's what I'm interested in, or to tell the same video player again that that's what I'm interested in. GPII will allow me to say, if captions are available, I want them. I'll just note that related aspects of GPII have special value in supporting learners with disabilities in higher education, if anyone is interested in particular in that. So it's a huge chore today for disability services people on campuses to try to provide the technology that individuals need. GPII brings with it a shift to a subscription model of access and use of tools, which makes it much easier for that kind of thing to be managed. Well, these things do have some technical requirements, which I want to say something about. So one of the big ones is something that computer scientists have long known is important, but we're negligent about really living up to this. And that is, it's really critical to work on the separation of content and presentation. This is really a major theme. One of the things that's happening that helps with this is the emergence of what we can call content APIs, or content application program interfaces. So instead of people working all the time by thinking about what some information is going to look like, they put their effort instead into thinking, well, how can I provide programmatic access to particular content, which leads to that separation. It doesn't look any particular way, it's just content until somebody presents it. That, of course, means that there's a companion need. We need to have much better tools for going from an API flexibly to a presentation that's going to work for a particular individual. While we're at it, when we're thinking about the software tools that are used for creating presentations or anything else that we're talking about, we should be paying due attention to the accessibility of those tools themselves. So today, too often, people with disabilities have to hope that somebody without a disability figures out what they need and then uses the software tools that are out there to create that thing for them. we should instead work hard to move to a world where a person with disability has command of all the tools for creating software that are available to others. Finally, there's much work to be done on developing new, more inclusive representations of information generally. I'll just mention a couple of examples that happen to be one that my colleagues and I are working on. Many of you will know about the ancient lines of force representation for electric or magnetic fields. It goes all the way back to Faraday. We're doing some work on an interactive simulation that uses that lines of force representation. Well, it turns out lines of force are actually a pretty crummy way to represent fields. So, for example, the strength of a field is represented by the density of lines, which is really kind of an odd conception. We're developing, with promising early results, purely auditory representations of the fields, which make the strength and orientation of the field actually more apparent than it is from the visual representation. So this is an example, we hope, of a case where some work that's perhaps motivated initially by making a representation more inclusive can produce a representation that actually has advantages for lots of people. Another example that we're working on is non-visual visual programming. Some of you will know that it's increasingly common for children to be introduced to programming using a class of tools called visual programming tools. There are a wide variety of these. But this has really unfortunate effects, and actually someone like Mara interested in the history of technology, one of the things you pick up is that advances in technology have unfortunately often been accompanied by steps backward in inclusion. So the move from textual interfaces for programming to visual ones, unfortunately, is such a bad move. But influenced by the work of the blind computer scientist T.V. Raman at Google, we're showing that we can have a declarative representation of a visual program that can be accessed in a purely non-visual way. And an interesting side effect of that is that if you have a non-visual programming system, suddenly you can program on your phone with its tiny screen, or even with no screen at all, if you wanted to. So there's an agenda, a partial agenda. There's lots to do on that agenda. A kind of a meta goal that I and colleagues have is to develop a public-private partnership to create and prosecute this research agenda, recognizing that there's a very big public interest to be served in pushing along on the challenges and opportunities of the sort I've just tried to list.
Well, I'm equally delighted and honored to be here, and certainly the least technically capable of any of these panelists. I'm a law and policy person, but as part of my work flowing from the UN Disability Treaty, I've worked in 40 countries, and part of those rights have to do with access to information and communication technology. So just to put first a sort of personal umbrella on and then some thoughts that we've had. ICT has enabled me in being able to write better and search out better and do lots of things better, but I'm of an age where I didn't grow up with it and where it didn't have a profound effect on my education, etc., unless we count typewriters, etc. But what I find interesting and annoying and frustrating, and why I work in the area a little bit, is that friends of mine who were looking forward to great enablers through information technology have found it in some ways enabling and in other ways very disappointing. So part of the impetus on why I write sometimes or investigate in this area is friends who are visually impaired or print disabled who we're looking forward to being able to do all kinds of things just like everyone else, and now find that the same barriers that existed in the physical environment have now transferred over into the virtual environment. Or friends who have cognitive and intellectual disabilities who thought that they could be enabled in certain areas, and they have been, have found that in other ways the language isn't plain and easy to understand, and that parallels other friends who are not native English speakers, or other friends who other sorts of challenges and abilities. So my work in thinking about the internet and information communication technology is one very age-related, and that is, part of the excuses and part of the justifications for lack of access to the physical world over the years have been, well, we didn't know disabled people existed. Really? I mean, honest, gosh. That's why we built those buildings that way, and never thought about people with disabilities as being part of the world, just like we at one point didn't think about women being doctors or people of color being police officers or whatever it is, and we had to readjust. Well, with the web and the internet, what's going on here? It's 25 or so years old, and it gets created every day, and the websites get recreated every couple of years or however much they're updated, and the people who are doing it are much cooler than me, which is not a high standard, but much cooler and hip than I am. They grew up mostly with the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. They grew up with an IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They've seen people with disabilities, if we're just talking about this country. So it's no longer a question of invisibility, and why isn't everyone being included? And that bothers me and puzzles me. And it seems to me that at this point we no longer have the excuse of, oops, we didn't think about it, because we wouldn't do that with any other group. Right? We wouldn't do that with pretty much any other group that would want access to the public sphere. But yeah, we continue to do it with disability. And some of the pushback on it globally, it hasn't been framed in terms of artistic freedom and autonomy, as in I want to design my website as I want to design it, because it doesn't affect the design of the website including those accessibility features. It's not framed in terms of this will cost us money. Remember Clint Eastwood not wanting to have access to his little shishi restaurant, he said, because I've never seen a disabled person show up. Well, of course not, Clint. One, you're unfriendly. Two, they can't get into your restaurant. So it's not an economic issue. And then there's also these disconnects, and it goes back to some things that other panelists have mentioned. So, the business case, this must be a huge population. And if we blur the lines on disability and talk about individuals who are aging and using either glasses or other things, or non-native English speakers, I don't get the lack of connection with why there isn't this overwhelming business motivation to include everyone, including those with print and other disabilities. There's a disjuncture between policymakers, CEOs, and then whoever is far down the line with them, because you get statements about diversity and inclusion and valuing difference, etc. And then you get down to the actual programming level and it's not there. And if I'm going to go horizontally, I see parallels in things like employment, where we all talk about inclusion and diversity, etc., and people with disabilities, but then you get to the employment level, and at least in this country, we're hovering around 80% within the working age population. Or we talk about development issues outside the country in the international sphere, and we do all this wonderful, amazing work, but we don't include people with disabilities. So I'm not exactly sure about why those things go on, and I certainly am not savvy to them in the technical world, but I see it in lots of parallels. This piece was that Solon mentioned was very American. Every now and then I do write as an American academic. Most of my work is outside the U.S. But it goes back to a long time to feeling frustration about lack of access to the internet and the web generally. And long ago, we convened a conference on access for people with cognitive impairments, and I was sweet enough to come and be fantastic at that. But I can't say we've seen a lot of progress in the 7 or 8 years from it. And a dear friend, Jonathan Lazar, who you should definitely have some and I are going to do a conference at Radcliffe and a book coming out of it on global issues related to it. But it's this amazing area of potential, an amazing area of inclusion, and not to be too kumbaya-ish about it, but You know, if we think about some of the awful, because I'm a human rights lawyer, if we think about some of the awful things that are going on in the world and how we want to bridge between populations and cultures and religions and whatever else you want to fill in the blank on, why is it that we're not including as many people to interact and get to know each other as we can? So, in terms of this and the U.S., the law is very simple, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on law because we'd rather do Q&A and have fun. But you know, the ADA was written before Al Gore invented the internet, so the word internet does not appear right in the statute or in the laundry list. And so the law itself is kind of boring in that you get some judges saying, well, wait a minute, the word internet doesn't appear here. Well, you know, guess what? At the time the ADA was written, the word carpal tunnel syndrome wasn't quite there either, because we weren't all doing this with our fingers, type, and you know, carpal tunnel syndrome was working out in Iowa in the meat plant and cutting the same piece of chicken the same way 40 times over, 40 hours a week. So, you know, they said that, you know, public accommodation, the place where we all interact, the place where we learn, the place where we socialize, the place where we purchase things, engage in business, commercial transactions, etc., had to be brick and mortar, physical structure. And that's not the way the world works in 2014. It's not even the way the world works in 2000 maybe. It's certainly not the way the world is going to continue to move in the direction of. And so the law to us seemed very clear in this particular piece that we wrote about. But more so, we were thinking about public accommodation, about some of the things that motivated policymakers and lawmakers in the U.S. to, break down some of, not enough, but some of the racial barriers that existed. And some of the arguments there, it seemed to us, exist very much in parallel to the circumstance of people with disabilities, the ability to engage in commerce, which again, there's this amazing disconnect. If you ask me about the confessions of the target internet czar, we can do that in Q&A. But the ability to engage in commerce, the ability to have dignity and to be able to go where everyone else goes. In terms of race, they were talking about not being able to go into a hotel, into a deli counter, into a movie theater, etc., if you happen to be of a certain racial background. Well, nowadays, many of my friends with various forms of disabilities can't go into those places. It's also astounding and perplexing to me why federal and state governments, which know about the Rehab Act, which predates the ADA by 25 years, why are our federal websites so inaccessible? What excuse is there for that? It bothers me on an individual level because, after a week after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, I was in New Orleans and the Gulf and went to psychiatric hospitals and found, people who had been locked up and not let out. Some survived, some did not. And now we're years later, and a colleague and I looked at emergency alert services in 3, Northeast U.S. states, and most of them are not accessible to people with disabilities. So, what's up with that? Why haven't we learned? Why are we not being inclusive? So those are some of the things that we were thinking about, and that bothers me as an individual. That's more politics than law, but I don't quite understand it, and I hope at some point someone can explain to me why designers don't put things in. I guess the last thing I'll say is, 11 years ago when we set up our project on disability and created a website that is still in conformity with the regulations. Judy Brewer, sends me emails now and then and says, "You're still okay. You're still okay." I say, "Thanks, Judy." But in trying to create this website, of course, we were going to be inclusive, and not only inclusive of those with print disabilities, but also, because we focus on people with intellectual disabilities being in plain language and accessible to all forms of disability. And we interviewed web designers, people who graduated from Harvard and MIT and were all in Cambridge, and they came by, and we interviewed 18 of them. And my wife had this list. She was eventually our project manager, wrote the content, etc. Here's the accessibility features that we want and need. And they would invariably tell us. The first 17 told us, can't do it, can't be done, doesn't exist. Which, never tell my wife something can't be done. Just don't do that. Especially when she's done her research and she said, well, wait a minute, here's Human Rights Watch, they do that. and here's, my USA, they do that, and here's whatever. And then we would ask them, well, you're designing websites, don't you have any ethical consideration about designing it for everyone to use? And they said, oh no, we only do on spec what people ask for. So eventually our web designer is an ex-hippie from Berkeley, he's in Berkeley actually yet, who said, of course everything I do is accessible, what are you kidding? Right? And it is, and we've referred her to other places. So that's all I have to say about this. I hope we can have some good interaction and
So yes, please, everyone join me in thank you. So we are running a little short on time, so rather than me attempt to pose questions, I thought I can just jump right into the group discussion, and maybe if there's a way to sort of even allow the panelists to pose questions to each other if any have occurred to them. Okay, so then if I can just open it up and if people have questions for that. Yeah, great.
I realized that as you were talking, I realized that in a way I could have framed my discussion of different design principles to dovetail into your talk better had we conferred beforehand, because actually, there's a myth around universal design principles that if you have a universally designed building, or if the internet's universally designed, or a particular website, you won't need these different add-ons. And a lot of the tools that I was describing, or that I have my students use, are add-ons to make up for the fact that the automated captioning on YouTube doesn't work very well. A deaf person doesn't have the option to just automatically have everything be captioned. And I'm just curious, since you are a programmer and you're working on this, if the GPII comes to fruition, are there still going to be things that can't be done? I mean, I'm guessing audio description is one of them, and there's just so much video and so many images online. Is crowdsourcing really the solution or not?
Well, I guess a parallel to Michael's wife, never tell a technologist that something can't be done. So on this question of audio description, one of the things that I guess didn't get into my bio is that I spent a lot of the last 3 years working in Washington at the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. And one of the things that my colleague Kathy McCoy and I did there was to reach out to IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. So they're spending a boatload of taxpayer money on an amazing array of technologies, one of which is the automated analysis of surveillance videos. Well, that's not the whole solution, but certainly in the form that they're doing it now. But progress is possible even on things like that if we organize ourselves to do it. And the landscape is certainly going to remain spotty for the foreseeable future, but it's hard to identify any issue in this space that we can't reasonably expect to make technical progress on if we put our minds to it. If we're willing to invest in analyzing surveillance videos for security reasons, well, let's double dip and let's generalize that work.
Can I say something about that? I think that often, and for me too, I think it's often tempting to see inaccessibility as a technical problem, like we're trying to figure out how to do accessibility. We're trying to figure out how to solve some thorny issue. But I don't think inaccessibility is a technical problem or a technology problem. I think it's a social problem. And for the reasons that I was saying before, the Lessig quote that cyberspace has no essential nature. Like it's I think like Clayton just said, there's no reason we couldn't do it another way. There's nothing about the technology that makes it inaccessible, except that we designed it one way, and we could have designed it another way. Michael said rightly, normatively rightly, that people with disabilities aren't invisible. We don't have the excuse that we don't know they exist. But I think I may be more skeptical or harsher in my judgment. I feel like people with disabilities, they were socially invisible, but not really. People knew they existed, they just didn't care about inclusion. And I think that people with disabilities are often invisible in software design meetings, but for sort of strange reasons. So it doesn't surprise me at all that technology comes out, that software comes out as inaccessible, because of course it does. It also reflects all kinds of other biases, and I think there are other populations that end up being invisible online or in gaming or in new technology. I think it happens to women. I think it happens to racial minorities all the time. It happens to non-Americans all the time. There's a lot of development of software and mobile devices that's centered on a certain kind of demographic that reflects the designers more than their users. For a long time, when I was a designer, when I was a programmer, we said that gamers were men. Were young men. We thought video games were mostly played by young men, and I remember being shocked when we saw the first study that showed that more women played video games than men. We were shocked by that, and then we realized it was because we had the wrong definition of games. Like, we were just thinking about a certain kind of video game, like Xbox or first-person shooters or something. But like when you included things like Minesweeper or other kinds of games or social games, the audience was actually majority women, and we just didn't know that. But like, we knew it, but we didn't know. We were just thinking about it wrong. So that's what I mean. They're not technology problems, they're social problems, and so it doesn't surprise me when they show up in technology.
I just have a comment. So, what role does computer science education have to play here? Because one thing that we do find is that there's virtually no attention in any UI or CHI programs on the accessibility approaches that can be undertaken about accessibility standards. When you work for organizations trying to hire software engineers, they don't know what WCAG is or what Section 508 is. And so it's really, I think, a shortcoming in the academic training programs that they don't focus on accessibility. I think Clayton's nodding, probably has an opinion on that.
I have an opinion and a load of guilt. So this week I'm finishing a course that includes user interface design. Practicum as a part of it, and the treatment of accessibility in that is way inadequate. And if that's true for me, I know it's true for most other people. So yeah, you're on something. There was a time when one could have looked to accreditation to deal with this, but that's not actually the state of affairs currently, as far as I can tell. So it goes back into that big social bucket of problems that we can label that way without knowing what to do about them. Actually, maybe I'll add an example that illustrates a dimension of this quote social issue. So I can remember who mentioned, maybe more than one person, the notion that the aging population should be a driver of a lot of activity in this space. So I haven't been doing it for a while, but I was working quite a bit for a while in the mobile phone industry. And I won't name the vendor, but somebody working at a major mobile phone vendor said, we know we could sell a whole lot of phones to elderly people if we designed them differently. The sort of thing you see on sort of the back pages of magazines, big numbers, all that kind of thing, coming from bit players. So this mainstream vendor said, we know we could sell a lot of phones if we would design that way, but we're never going to do that. Why? We're never going to do that because we've learned that the mobile phone business is intensely driven by fashion, and fashion is a youth thing. So if we were to be identified with a phone for old people with big numbers, it would kill the rest of our business. This was their analysis. And try to peel that onion, I think, is really interesting. So there's the underlying set of attitudes expressed there that it's about fashion, that fashion is about youth, so that's one stratum. And then, but where does somebody running a company, why is it they just knuckle under to that and just accept, well, okay, we'll exclude a major segment of our market just because fashion works that way. So there's a set of social issues for you. You know, what could we do about them? Good question.
I mean, I think that is where design comes in, and that's the work that people like Graham Pullen and Sarah Hendren, who are designers, are trying to do to make accessible technology either resonate with other kinds of technology, or to make it sexy, or to make it not medical. I mean, there's a lot of medicalized technology out there that isn't medical. To change the aesthetic, the given aesthetic. So, I mean, design isn't the only answer, but that is some of the work that those folks are doing.
And it still brings us all the way back to one of the questions that several of us have raised, which is, if you can change your app's interface, etc., so that you can increase the number of people who come and give you money, why isn't that happening? Right? You teach law and economics for Bob Cooter, right? Every law and econ person shouts rationality, but clearly it's not rational and it's not in self-interest. So where's the disjunction?
Yeah, that's why I wanted an economist on my committee, because I think that you can start with an analysis of racial segregation. And you could ask why a restaurant that could make more money selling to all races would choose to be a whites-only restaurant, but they did. And Bob has done, I think, some good theoretical work explaining why, using economics to explain why that might happen. And there, actually, one of the things I thought that I could do in my dissertation was do a long tail analysis of the internet and say, for example, maybe cyberspace is different because it allows you to, what I said, it gives you an aggregation of distant customers. So, meaning like if you have a store or a restaurant and it has stairs, it's not accessible to someone in a wheelchair, but you think that there's only one person in a wheelchair within 50 miles of you. Maybe it's not cost effective to design, like if you're just not thinking about rights or anything normative, but you're just thinking about cost effectiveness, maybe you don't gain enough money serving that one customer to justify the expense of the ramp. But in cyberspace, your customers all live next door to your store, or they live in your store. And so, or more accurately, your store lives in their house. And so now you've got like a long tail effect, where suddenly there are more people at the end of the curve than there were in the on the left side. And maybe cyberspace changes the cost benefits analysis. Maybe it's true that you're an idiot if you ignore your blind customers, or if you ignore customers with disabilities. So maybe the economics works out differently. But that being said, what I've sort of started to notice, and I'm pretty sure is right, but I'm not totally sure yet. I've started to notice that I don't think companies make these decisions on a cost benefits analysis. I don't think they sit down and do it. I know they say they do. I just don't think that they actually do. I think that what happens, like when I was at Microsoft, the reason I was telling you about Fran and Charlie and Malcolm, these use cases, because we didn't have anybody with disabilities in the set of use cases. And I don't know why. Like, I just didn't think about it, but it wasn't my job to come up with them. We had social scientists that did that, but they just didn't come up with it, and I don't know why. They could have, and if they had, our websites would have been accessible. Like, that's what I mean, it's not a technology problem. Because when I was doing testing, I looked at my use cases, and I looked at the spec, and then I designed my test cases to fit those. And if I had one that was, if I'd had a use case that was a user with disabilities, I would have designed a set of tests, and we would have rejected the project when it failed those tests, the product when it failed those tests. We would have filed bugs. They would have been fixed for release. So, like, technology problem solved. But we didn't have it, and I honestly don't know why. I think that I don't think anybody sits. In other words, what I'm saying is I don't think very many people sit down and say, we thought about it, we thought about accessibility, gonna cost too much, let's not build that into our website. Because like as Michael points out, it doesn't cost that much. I'm not even sure it costs anything if you do it from the beginning. Like it's just, that's like saying, it costs a lot for our website to have text on it. That's sort of the point of the website. Like it costs something to design it, but it's money that you're gonna spend anyway.
So I want to agree and disagree on the question of whether it's a technical problem. And one way to do that might be to say it's not a technology problem, but there is a technology opportunity. So the fact is that whatever the technical solutions are, as we're all agreeing, people are not using them in droves. Okay? Given that they are not, there's a technical opportunity to make it so that it doesn't matter whether people are being slothful or discriminatory or whatever else, that I think it's within reach of us technically to create technology where people don't have to do anything actually to make their work inclusive. I think we ought to do that, and then we can sort out the underlying social issues at our leisure.
I mean, I do think for those of us, again, who aren't programmers, but who feel like we want to be conscientious or active consumers, it is learning how to test web accessibility that will allow you to choose, to make decisions with your own website or your university websites that are accessible. For instance, NYU, my department went over to WordPress, and we previously hadn't been using WordPress, and all of the faculty were given WordPress home pages. WordPress, those themes are made by lots of different people. As you know, it's notoriously inaccessible, and it took me a long time I immediately realized that suddenly my page was no longer accessible to screen readers. So then I had to do all this research to find a theme that was accessible, and it took me quite a long time to do that. And I ended up using Blaskin on someone else's recommendation. But for those of us who aren't on the programming end, I think doing something like this training session that the NEH is funding to teach humanists how to test websites, what tools are already out there. The UC system has a wonderful set of tools compiled online already, just so that you are making conscientious decisions about the websites you're putting together or sponsoring, given that you're in a university environment.
So I think we're already running past time, but I will, if I can, do I have the discretion to take a few more minutes? Okay, so I'll take this question and then we'll try to close out, please.
This is a follow-up to what Clayton was saying about developing technology so that programmers don't have to worry about accessibility. So it seems like this has been happening on the internet, but there's kind of a time delay. As people build new technologies and play with new technologies, the standards that build in accessibility come years later. For instance, this issue of separating content and presentation helps a lot for accessibility, but that was many, many years after people were all doing all sorts of crazy things building websites. So is there a sort of more meta strategy that one could take so that newer technologies that people play around with on the web have accessibility baked in earlier?
So next week you should have a panel with the ETS people, because I just couldn't be more excited about some of the work that I was hearing that the group there is doing. So part of the opportunity is that even though we live with them, none of us should really accept the software tools that are available today. The software, well, I have to restrain myself. Software is sort of barely adequate, and we think it's wonderful. That is, the whole technology stack there. What Mark and Jason and others are developing is a fundamentally semantic way of actually creating stuff. So instead of thinking in terms of particular behaviors or particular appearances, to create software based on a semantic specification of what's being done. That's the sort of thing which can be so much easier than the craft that we take, sort of as routinely our fate in life as software developers today. That could be so much easier that it actually could get us ahead of the curve in the way that you're pointing out we're not now. So the notion is we're not just sort of cosmetically working on making the stuff we're already doing better. but we're actually developing fundamentally superior paradigms that will both deliver superior inclusion and make the whole enterprise of creating software fundamentally easier. I'm an optimist.
So I think we have to unfortunately close, but maybe I'll sneak in one last idea, which I hope will maybe generate some optimism as well, which is, it seems to me that it's a common experience that technology fails users. That like the more common experience is frustration with technology, and so is there also an opportunity here, specifically with digital technology, to kind of create certain solidarities and to interrupt the kind of take it for granted nature of artifacts, so that we can build greater conversations between communities who otherwise might see these as the way things necessarily need to be. Is there something kind of unique here, a unique opportunity? And I mean, we can close out with that maybe if you have any thoughts.
I mean, I kind of think about Michael's example of the restaurant that thinks it doesn't have any customers with disabilities. It's like there's room for optimism if people with disabilities are allowed to show up, are enabled to show up, and if you don't think that you have customers with disabilities, then you're never going to make any progress on it. So I think technology has a lot of potential. Software and mobile devices have huge amounts of potential, but I'm skeptical that I mean, like Clayton. I love Clayton's idea of finding ways to get around bad design, to make bad design accessible. But I mean, that's what screen readers did in the first place, and that was the whole point. Let's provide a product that can read what's on the screen, and it's on the user side, not on the developer side. And then websites came along and it started breaking them. And it was like the problem wasn't that nobody had screen readers. The problem, blind people had been using computers for a long time and writing code just fine. And then visual tools came out, and they had to adapt. And then websites like actively broke screen readers. It wasn't like so. I guess I'm just sort of cautious. The solution ends up being something that's on the user side. It's great until it breaks, and then you still have the same exclusion problem.
Okay, in that event, I think I think we're unfortunately out of time. I've already pushed us beyond. But please stick around and talk with the panelists afterwards. But before that, please just once again join me in thanking the panelists for a great discussion.